Summer 1943 found a German prisoner of war seated in a dusty camp in Tennessee, fixated on a small, brown-wrapped rectangle. The oppressive heat of the southern sun slightly softened its edges, leaving a faint, oily sheen where the chocolate beneath threatened to surrender and melt. It had been 1939 since he had last tasted anything so purely sweet, back when the war was young and the streets of Germany still managed to maintain a facade of prosperity. Now, deep in enemy territory, a land he had been meticulously taught was weak, starving, and decadent. He was being handed a ration that felt like a feast in disguise. He unwrapped the bar with painstaking slowness, fearful the vision might dissolve. When the first dark square finally touched his tongue, his world began to subtly, yet irrevocably, shift. This unexpected bounty was the antithesis of the welcome German soldiers had been promised. They had been assured they would face chains, brutal starvation, and total humiliation at the hands of their American captors. Their generals had guaranteed that surrender would equate to a sentence of prolonged misery. Goebbels' propaganda machine had consistently painted the United States as a nation defined by mongrel weakness, a decadent society too soft to fight and too impoverished to sustain its own population, let alone feed its prisoners. Yet here, thousands of miles across the ocean, following months of brutal desert combat in North Africa, they encountered a reality that shattered every preconceived expectation. Instead of stale, meager crusts, they found fresh, white bread. The bitter, substitute ersatz coffee was replaced by steaming, fragrant, real coffee. Instead of thin, watery cabbage soup, their trays held canned meat, processed cheese, chewing gum, and chocolate bars. For the men of Rommel's storied Africa Corps, capture came abruptly after 2 exhausting years of relentless desert warfare, punctuated by constant dust storms and gnawing hunger. They were finally forced into surrender in Tunisia. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured during that climactic final campaign. Of these, thousands were shipped across the Atlantic under heavy guard, deposited into hastily constructed camps scattered across the American South and Midwest. The transatlantic journey itself felt surreal. They boarded the ships as enemies of democracy but stepped onto American soil as prisoners who could hear the laughter of children just beyond the barbed wire, watch farmers tending vast, fertile fields, and smell the rich aroma of dinners drifting from nearby towns. The war still raged violently in Europe, but in the United States, life appeared profoundly normal, untouched, and abundantly rich. The first major shock arrived the moment they entered the mess halls. The German soldiers lined up, expecting gruel, bracing themselves for humiliation, scorn, or outright cruelty. Instead, the guards handed them heavy metal trays piled high with items many had not seen in years. Fresh vegetables, bright white potatoes, thick slabs of meat, and real butter. Some meals even included dessert, ice cream in the summer, cakes on special holidays. And with each ration kit came unexpected, commonplace treasures. Cigarettes, chocolate, gum, and candy bars. The U.S. Army regarded these small comforts as simple essentials for soldier morale during wartime. To the Germans, they were luxuries that bordered on the unbelievable. To fully comprehend the depth of this cultural and psychological shock, one must recall the state of rations in wartime Europe. By 1943, German civilians were subsisting on thin slices of bread, ersatz spreads made of ground-up beets, thin watery soups, and coffee substitutes brewed from roasted acorns or barley. Meat was a rarity, butter scarcer still, and real chocolate was practically mythical. Cigarettes, when they could be found, were hoarded like gold and traded on the black market for outrageous sums. Even soldiers in the Wehrmacht carried only dry biscuits and meager, thin sausage. Frontline rations were grim shadows of the abundance they had known in peacetime. Hunger gnawed constantly at both the civilian population and the troops. To them, food was mere survival, stripped bare of any luxury or delight. And then came America, the K-ration, the standard field kit issued to every U.S. Soldier typically contained biscuits, canned cheese, powdered lemonade mix, a tin of Spam or ham and eggs, a fruit bar, and, crucially, always a small block of chocolate, chewing gum, and a pack of cigarettes. To the Americans, these were the absolute bare minimum. Soldiers grumbled incessantly about the monotony of the Spam, mocked the taste of the powdered drinks, and cursed the lack of variety. Many traded away their rations, longing for the comforts of home cooking. But for the German prisoners who received these very same kits behind the barbed wire, each package was nothing short of astonishing. Here was immediate, tangible proof of a society so staggeringly wealthy that it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own fighting men. Initially, the prisoners eyed these gifts with profound suspicion. Could this be a trick, a softening up measure intended to precede intense interrogation? But the pattern repeated, day after day. The cigarettes were undeniably real. The chocolate was rich, sweet, and smooth. The gum snapped between their teeth with a flavor of mint that felt impossibly exotic and foreign. When one soldier unwrapped a genuine Hershey bar, he whispered in disbelief, "It tastes of another world." Another recalled years later, "The first cigarette I lit in an American camp carried more meaning than any speech. It told me this country possessed a scale of riches we simply could not imagine." Joseph Goebbels' propaganda had always relied heavily on inciting fear. He told Germans the Allies were brutally sadistic, that capture meant certain starvation, and that America was a chaotic, impoverished land. But here, in the camps of Tennessee, Texas, and Nebraska, reality stood in stark, irrefutable contrast. Prisoners ate 3 generous meals a day, often consuming more calories than they had known in months. They were issued cigarettes freely, the smoke curling up like visible proof of American plenty. They were given chocolate bars that German children might have only dreamed of but rarely tasted. And when they looked at their surroundings, they saw that the American guards treated such items, these luxuries, as entirely commonplace. Candy bars cost 5 cents at the canteen. Cigarettes could be bought in endless packs. To the Americans, these were simple trifles. To the Germans, they were unimaginable treasures. The effect was profoundly disorienting. Many of these POWs had gone to war convinced of their nation's absolute superiority, taught that the Third Reich was the pinnacle of modern power and efficiency. Yet here they were, prisoners in a land where even their enemies were fed with such staggering abundance. This sheer material excess became a quiet, corrosive weapon, undermining every lie they had been told. If the Americans were truly so weak, how could they afford such casual generosity? If they were so decadent, how were they able to fight with such overwhelming force? If they were so poor, why did their prison camps feel like places of strange comfort compared to the scarcity and hunger of Europe? The bitterness of defeat was instantly sharpened by this devastating contrast. Back in Germany, families were starving. In America, prisoners were eating chocolate. One former POW later wrote, "It was not the barbed wire that truly trapped us. It was the crushing sight of such plenty. We realized our leaders had fundamentally lied to us. And that realization was far harder to swallow than the defeat itself. Defeat meant laying down arms. Chocolate meant questioning everything." The American guards themselves were often completely oblivious to the massive psychological impact of these simple rations. To them, a cigarette was nothing more than a smoke break. Chocolate, a small pleasure between duties. They laughed about Spam, joked about weak army coffee, and sometimes tossed spare candy to children outside the camp fences. They could not possibly grasp how each casual gesture landed like a psychological hammer blow upon German national pride. To men raised in a culture of rigid scarcity, these easy, casual acts displayed a wealth of resources and an effortless generosity that defied all imagination. Inside the camps, the rations quickly evolved into more than mere sustenance. They became powerful symbols, tokens of a larger, unsettling truth. Cigarettes rapidly turned into the camp currency, traded among prisoners for small favors and services. Chocolate was meticulously hoarded, savored piece by piece, and occasionally mailed home in letters as tangible proof of this bizarre American reality. When these packages arrived in Germany containing real candy or gum, families often flatly refused to believe it. Surely, they thought, this was propaganda in reverse. Surely America could not afford to waste such riches on mere prisoners. Yet the truth lay there, wrapped in colorful foil and brown paper. As days bled into weeks, the initial shock deepened into quiet, persistent reflection. The prisoners began to talk among themselves. What did it truly mean that their captors shared such luxuries, even with enemies? What did this reveal about a society that placed chocolate bars into ration kits, not as an occasional indulgence, but as a basic necessity? Slowly, a profound realization began to seep in. They were witnessing the power of an economy and a culture so fundamentally different from their own that it might as well have originated on another planet. And in that realization, seeds were planted, seeds that would grow long after the war concluded, shaping how many of these men viewed democracy, prosperity, and freedom itself. For now, however, in 1943, they sat behind wire fences, tasting chocolate, lighting cigarettes, and struggling to reconcile pervasive propaganda with inescapable reality. The bitter taste of defeat mingled with the sweet taste of American abundance. Every bite, every puff, told them that the world was far larger and stranger than they had been taught. And as they lay on their bunks at night, wrappers crinkling softly in their pockets, one haunting question remained. If this was only the beginning, what greater shocks awaited them still? The initial sweetness of the chocolate was enough to confuse the prisoners, but it was the steady curl of cigarette smoke that began to truly haunt them. In Europe, a cigarette was not simply tobacco wrapped in paper. It represented wealth, power, and immediate relief from gnawing hunger and intense stress. It was the kind of item men would happily barter their boots for, trade their bread rations for, or even risk their lives to obtain. In 1943 Germany, one single cigarette could grease the wheels of survival in a prison cell, purchase a small favor from a weary guard, or buy warmth for a brutal night. Cigarettes were treasure, the most sought-after currency in a society collapsing under the weight of war. And yet here, in the American prison camps scattered across the heartland, the Germans found themselves being issued cigarettes in bulk, as casually as the bread rolls. Each K-ration kit contained a small, neatly packed quantity of them, often Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields, tucked alongside the biscuits and canned cheese. To American soldiers, these cigarettes were merely expected, one more necessity of life at war. To the German prisoners, they were astonishingly valuable, more significant than coins, more meaningful than pay slips. They were undeniable tokens of a nation so wealthy and assured it could hand out luxuries to its sworn enemies without a second thought. The arithmetic of abundance, as one prisoner later described it, could be measured in cigarettes. If a man smoked 2 a day and still had 8 left over, he instantly became rich. In scarcity-ridden Germany, that surplus would have been unthinkable. Within days, the camps developed into miniature, thriving economies where cigarettes served as the dominant currency. A skilled tailor might mend a coat in exchange for 5 cigarettes. A talented cook might manage to subtly improve the bland rations for the cost of 2. A man with musical skills might sing for a cigarette or 2, and those with extra stock could hire labor or purchase small luxuries from others. The American guards seemed almost blind to the true value of what they so casually distributed. They would hand out full cartons, flick cigarettes from their own packs, and occasionally toss extras to prisoners without a second thought. To them, it was nothing. To the prisoners, it was a profound revelation of plenty. Candy, too, played its crucial role. Each ration kit included small pieces of chewing gum or a classic candy bar, sometimes Hershey's, sometimes Tootsie Rolls, sometimes fruit-flavored lozenges. Many of these men had not seen such items since their childhoods. The gum, especially, carried a strange magic, snapping with mint or fruit flavors that seemed too artificially vibrant to be real. One German prisoner once recalled chewing a single stick for hours, unable to bring himself to spit it out, convinced that if he did, the very taste of America would be gone forever. Another sent wrappers home in letters, tangible proof to his family that such abundance existed, though many relatives in Germany suspected it must be exaggeration or outright lies. The Germans began to study these rations like archaeologists uncovering a new civilization. They meticulously examined the labels on tins and wrappers, marveling at the bright fonts and playful, commercial logos. Even the packaging felt different, colorful, professional, exuberant. American food seemed designed not merely to feed but specifically to delight. In contrast, German packaging was plain, functional, and rigorously stripped of ornament. Here, a Hershey's wrapper spoke of a society that cared about simple pleasure as much as raw survival. To men raised in relentless austerity, this was a quiet but powerful education. Simple numbers tell a damning part of the story. A typical American K-ration provided approximately 3,000 calories, enough to fully sustain a soldier in the field, and included cheese, meat, biscuits, chocolate, powdered drinks, gum, and cigarettes. Compare that to a German soldier's field ration, perhaps 1,200 calories at the front, often less, supplemented only by whatever meager scraps could be scavenged. The contrast was staggering. Even as prisoners, the Germans consumed more calories and enjoyed more variety than many of their comrades still fighting and struggling in Europe. And this abundance was routine. The American supply lines were vast, efficient, and seemingly endless. The prisoners did the mental math and realized this was unequivocally not a society on the verge of collapse. This was a nation so immensely rich that even its enemies were well-fed. The irony deepened when they overheard American guards complaining about these very rations. Soldiers muttered about the monotony of Spam, rolled their eyes at the powdered lemonade, and joked about gum that lost its flavor too quickly. To the Americans, the food was tiresome, bland, uninspired, and barely tolerable. To the Germans, it was undeniable bounty. They savored each bite of Spam, salted and meaty, as if it were a rare delicacy. They treasured the gum long after its flavor had faded, chewing for comfort rather than taste. They smoked each cigarette slowly, inhaling not just tobacco, but the subtle fragrance of a society that could afford such open generosity. At night, the camps glowed faintly with hundreds of cigarette tips scattered in the darkness. Conversations rose softly over the fence lines, men trading stories, laughter, and the occasional cough from too much smoke. Some prisoners rationed their goods carefully, saving chocolate for special moments, hoarding cigarettes as precious currency. Others indulged freely, as if tasting freedom itself in each puff and bite. But all of them felt the same underlying shock. America's abundance was completely rewriting the script of the war. In Germany, propaganda had declared that the Allies starved their prisoners, that America was a land of breadlines and desperation. But the evidence before their eyes made those words ring hollow. Instead, they discovered a society that wasted food without thinking, that tossed candy bars to children as if they were mere pennies, that smoked cigarette after cigarette without fear of scarcity. One prisoner remembered watching an American guard light a cigarette, take only a few idle puffs, and then flick it away, half-finished, into the dirt. To the German, the sight was almost unbearable. He would have smoked every last shred down to the paper wrapper. Yet the guard wasted it with such casual, secure ease. That single, wasteful gesture carried more meaning than any military victory. It demonstrated the immense, unbridgeable gulf between the two worlds they inhabited. Slowly, the prisoners began to internalize this new arithmetic of abundance. Cigarettes were not merely smokes, they were proof of industrial power. Candy was not just sugar, it was evidence of limitless wealth. Each wrapper, each puff, each stick of gum became a small, inescapable revelation. And in that revelation lay the seeds of ideological collapse. If America could afford to casually waste what Germany treasured, then perhaps Germany was not destined for global dominance. Perhaps the Reich was not invincible. Perhaps true strength did not look like massed tanks and polished jackboots, but like a society that could manufacture millions of candy bars and hand them out to its soldiers and its enemies as casually as bread. The camps buzzed with quiet comparisons. Do you remember the bread lines in Hamburg? One prisoner would say, "Here they feed us meat 3 times a week. Back home cigarettes are worth gold." Another would reply, "Here they give them away." The more they talked, the more the contrast weighed on them. America was not the weak, decadent enemy they had been taught to despise. It was something else entirely. An industrial giant, a land where even prisoners lived better than many civilians in Europe. Not every prisoner accepted this easily. Some clung fiercely to the propaganda, insisting it was all a trick, that the abundance was temporary, that the Americans meant only to soften them up before revealing their true cruelty. But as weeks turned into months, those doubts grew harder to sustain. The rations never faltered. The cigarettes kept coming. The candy never disappeared. Reality itself became the most persuasive argument, stronger than any leaflet or speech. And reality said that America was strong, wealthy, and above all, confident enough to feed its enemies with kindness. Even humor found its place in this strange new economy. Germans joked among themselves that they would happily endure captivity if it meant a steady supply of chocolate and cigarettes. They laughed at the absurdity of prisoners smoking better than most generals back home. They teased each other about gaining visible weight in an enemy camp. Beneath the laughter, however, was a quiet, shared recognition. They were experiencing something profound. When letters arrived from Germany, the gulf widened further. Families described crippling shortages, gnawing hunger, and endless queues stretching around blocks for scraps of food. They begged desperately for cigarettes, for chocolate, for anything that could possibly be sent home. Prisoners sometimes mailed small packages of American goods only to have their families refuse to believe them. One mother wrote back in disbelief, "You say they give you candy? That cannot be true. We hear the Americans starve you." The prisoners knew otherwise. They lived the contradiction every day. The arithmetic of abundance was not only physical. It was deeply psychological. Each cigarette smoked, each candy bar consumed was a subtraction from Nazi propaganda and a powerful addition to a new worldview. The men began to wonder, if America treated its enemies with such generosity, what did it offer its own citizens? If prisoners lived this well, what must daily life be like outside the fences? Slowly, envy crept in, not only for the cigarettes, but for the society that could produce them in such endless supply. By late 1943, the camps had settled into rhythms. Cigarettes remained the lifeblood of their economies. Candy, the sweet punctuation to each day. German prisoners were no longer surprised by the abundance, but they were still profoundly unsettled by its meaning. The initial shock had dulled, but the questions it raised grew sharper. Could a nation built on such comforts truly be defeated? Could a regime that promised scarcity ever compete with one that produced plenty? The answers lay beyond their reach, but the seeds of doubt had been planted deep. Chocolate and cigarettes were not weapons in any official arsenal. Yet they proved more corrosive to ideology than bullets. Each puff of smoke, each square of chocolate dissolved illusions and replaced them with visions of a world where abundance was ordinary. And yet, as much as the prisoners marveled, they had not yet seen the full measure of America's wealth. For all the cigarettes and candy bars, for all the spam and gum, there were still greater shocks waiting in the wings. Shocks that would not only reshape their appetites, but transform their very sense of who held power in this war. In the quiet hum of the camp, where fences stretched like stitched seams across the American landscape, the prisoners began to notice not merely what they were given, but what was casually thrown away. A half-eaten sandwich abandoned on a plate. A chocolate bar bitten once and discarded. A cigarette stubbed out when half its length remained. To men shaped entirely by the ideology of scarcity, these sights were almost unbearable. They carried the full weight of revelation. The Americans, it seemed, lived in such overwhelming abundance that even waste was utterly casual. What a German would have hoarded for days, an American cast aside without a second thought. At first, the prisoners reacted with bitter envy, then with profound disbelief. One man stared at the trash bins behind the mess hall, filled with scraps of meat and bread, and muttered that in Hamburg, such refuse would have been picked clean in minutes. Another, watching an American guard flick away a still glowing cigarette, clenched his fists in frustration. For these men, every crumb and every curl of smoke held intrinsic value. Yet in America, plenty was so ordinary that even prisoners lived constantly surrounded by it. The arithmetic of abundance, which had begun with rations and cigarettes, now unfolded in full, unsettling color. The guards did not appear hateful or cruel. They laughed, joked, smoked, and moved with a casual ease that contrasted sharply with the rigid, mechanical discipline of the German army. They performed their duty, but they did not attempt to grind the prisoners down with overt hatred. Some even exchanged small, simple words across the fences, gestures of shared humanity that shocked the men more than threats would have. "How are you today?" one guard asked in halting German. A prisoner, startled by the unexpected civility, replied automatically, "Gut." It was a brief moment, but it cracked open the possibility that enemies could also simply be men. In the evenings, the prisoners heard the faint, strange strains of music drifting from radios outside the camp perimeter. Jazz, swing, and American folk songs. The rhythms were lively and unfamiliar, vastly unlike the martial marches of the Reich. To some, it felt like chaotic, undisciplined noise. To others, it sounded like freedom, like a society alive in ways they had been taught to despise. They began to see that prosperity was measured not only in food and cigarettes, but in laughter, in music, in the casual ease of a people who had never felt bombs rain down upon their cities. Letters home continued to deepen the contrast. Families in Germany described devastating air raids, crushing hunger, and queues that stretched around city blocks for scraps of food. They asked desperately for news, for comfort, for anything that could be sent. When prisoners wrote back confirming they had chocolate and cigarettes, many relatives still could not bring themselves to believe it. Some assumed the men were mocking them or had been seduced by enemy lies. "You must be exaggerating," one mother wrote. "It cannot be true that they feed you so well. We hear the Americans torture their prisoners." Yet the truth was undeniable to those living it. The lie of Nazi propaganda collapsed each time a cigarette was lit, each time chocolate melted on the tongue. And still the guards complained. They grumbled about spam, about coffee too weak or too strong, about the crushing monotony of the meals. To them, these rations were disappointing, uninspired. To the prisoners, they were a feast. That irony cut deep. The very items Americans cursed as inadequate were more than most Germans had seen in years. It was not just abundance. It was casual abundance, so securely rooted that people felt comfortable mocking it. That mockery revealed something profound, a confidence so strong that even dissatisfaction was a luxury. Slowly, the prisoners began to look beyond the fences with different eyes. They saw American children playing with toys carved from wood and tin, easily eating candy bars without ceremony. They saw towns untouched by bombings, houses standing solid, farms stretching with corn and wheat. It seemed utterly impossible, a mirage. Back in Germany, cities were groaning under incessant air raids. Buildings were reduced to smoldering ruins, and fear was a constant shadow stalking every street. Yet here, even in the middle of a global conflict, life appeared entirely untouched by chaos or want. One prisoner whispered to another, "If this is how they lived during war, how must it be in peace?" The psychological transformation deepened with every passing week. The men who had been indoctrinated to view America as a crude, chaotic, mongrel nation began to perceive it as something fundamentally different, a mature civilization whose inherent strength required no aggressive boasting. They saw a quiet power reflected in the sheer excess of resources, confidence expressed through casual generosity, and a form of cultural superiority found in simple laughter and ease. They were becoming unwilling, then utterly fascinated, witnesses to unparalleled prosperity. The deeply ingrained image of America weak, starving, and chaotic was being systematically erased by every generous ration, every careless daily act of plenty. Some still resisted the shift stubbornly. Their nationalistic pride urged them to cling to the old narrative, to insist this abundance was temporary, merely a carefully constructed mask hiding America's impending weakness. They predicted the supply lines would inevitably dry up, the kindness would sour into malice, and the grand illusion would crumble. But reality, relentless and unchanging, slowly wore down their certainties. Day after day, the abundance never faltered. Day after day, the guards maintained ordinary, even-handed fairness. The mask, if it was one, never once slipped, and the resistance eventually thinned, leaving only quiet, profound awe in its place. The camp economies grew elaborate. Cigarettes became the standardized unit of wages, while chocolate served as the rare, highly prized currency of celebration and barter. Men organized concerts, plays, and small enterprises within the fences. Though confined, the men lived not only as prisoners but as close witnesses to a society that seemed to possess a boundless overflow of resources. The barbed wire fences themselves morphed from symbols of rigid captivity into mere dividers separating them from a vast, incomprehensible mystery beyond. They stared past the wire and asked themselves the haunting question: if prisoners ate like this, just how staggeringly rich must the ordinary American citizen be? What unsettled them most profoundly was the sheer effortlessness of it all. Abundance wasn't forced. It never felt like a calculated display of propaganda or a deliberate spectacle designed to impress. It simply was. The guards weren't handing out chocolate to win hearts or distributing cigarettes to manipulate loyalty. These items flowed naturally, seamlessly, part of the underlying machinery of a society so expansive that it considered luxuries to be basic necessities. This very naturalness was the solvent eroding their old certainties. If America barely seemed to notice its own staggering wealth, then perhaps its intrinsic strength was far deeper than any enemy had ever imagined. One night, a tremendous storm rolled across the sweeping plains. Lightning brutally split the night sky, thunder violently shook the foundations of the ground, and rain lashed the barracks' roofs. Huddled in their blankets, the men were instinctively reminded of Europe's dreaded storms of fire. Yet here, there were no bombs, no screaming sirens, no terror. The tempest passed quickly, and by morning the camp smoothly returned to its steady rhythms. Breakfast trays were filled instantly, cigarettes were routinely distributed, and candy bars were tossed out with casual disregard. The war, a reality of constant hunger and fear they had always known, felt distant, almost unreal. The very psychological distance from violence proved as jarring as the physical abundance of food. The personal transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A man who had staunchly refused to touch American goods now found himself harboring a persistent craving for chewing gum. Another who had sworn never to smoke the enemy's tobacco was actively bartering for more cigarettes. Habits changed, and loyalties shifted quietly, not through outright betrayal, but through grudging recognition. They remained soldiers of Germany, certainly, but in their hearts, they carried a destabilizing set of new questions. If their enemies lived like this, what kind of future awaited a defeated Germany? The camps evolved into immersive classrooms without formal teachers. Each meal was a critical lesson, each discarded cigarette but an unspoken lecture. The men learned not through words, but through sights, smells, and taste. Chocolate taught them that wealth could indeed be sweet. Cigarettes demonstrated that luxury could be routine. Wastefulness proved that prosperity could afford to be careless. And the guards, through their ordinary, consistent decency, taught them that enemies could uphold fairness even in moments of decisive victory. The cumulative effect was devastating to the old worldview. By 1944, thousands of these men had settled into routines that felt less like active torment and more like a bizarre, prolonged exile. They worked, traded, wrote letters home, and observed, always observing, the America surrounding them. They saw not just the material plenty, but the deep confidence that underwrote that plenty. Not just generosity, but the immense power required to sustain it. They began to internalize the sense that the war had already irretrievably tipped. Germany's grand promises of national greatness simply could not compete with this tangible, inescapable reality. And in that realization, something profound shifted within them. Yet there was one more layer to unfold, one more truth hidden in the abundance. It was not only their stomachs and habits that changed. It was their belief. Slowly, quietly, without speeches or force, America's prosperity began to silently and steadily chip away at the very foundations of their militant ideology. The men who had once marched proudly for a 1,000-year Reich now dared to wonder if the future belonged not to iron force, but to boundless plenty. Not to fear and obedience, but to casual freedom. The thought was dangerous, fragile, and utterly new. Yet it was there, whispered in the bunks, pondered over cigarette smoke, and tasted in every square of chocolate. And still they had not seen the greatest shock of all. For beyond the fences, beyond the rations and cigarettes, beyond even the laughter of the guards, lay a revelation so profound it would haunt them long after they returned home. They had glimpsed prosperity, but they had not yet truly faced its true meaning. That reckoning waited just ahead, carried on the same ships that would one day carry them back to a Germany they could no longer recognize. Ships groaned heavily in the harbors of 1945, their decks crowded with men who had once proudly worn desert uniforms beneath Rommel's banner, now draped in the gray fatigue of prisoners bound for home. They carried little. A few trinkets carved in the camp workshops, some blurred photographs of life behind the wire, and empty wrappers folded carefully like sacred relics. The chocolate was long gone, the cigarettes smoked, but the memory of those things clung to them with more weight than their rifles once had. Each man had been fundamentally remade, not by the sting of cruelty, but by the baffling, overwhelming generosity of their captors. And as the ships cut eastward across the unforgiving Atlantic, they knew they were sailing not just back to a broken Germany, but directly into the jaws of a crushing disillusionment. The docks they reached bore no resemblance to the Germany they remembered. Cities were utterly ruined, smoldering like the charred carcass of a vast forest fire. Bridges hung twisted across rivers. Trains no longer ran with the legendary German precision, and streets once vibrant with bakeries and cafes were now choked with dust and rubble. They stepped onto soil that smelled not of fresh bread and coal smoke, but of dust, ash, and palpable fear. Women were mournfully picking through heaps of ruins with baskets. Children lined up with rusty tin pails at soup kitchens, and the faces of the civilians bore the gaunt, hollow look of famine. In that devastating moment, the returning prisoners understood the bitter truth. The Reich that had promised eternal glory had delivered only utter ruin. The empire destined to last 1,000 years had withered and collapsed in less than 2 decades. Yet, deep in their pockets and imprinted on their minds, these men carried something fragile, almost forbidden, souvenirs of freedom. Empty Lucky Strike packs, flattened Hershey wrappers, the artificial sweetness of chewing gum, and the echo of swing music drifting over the camp fences. To their families, these tokens seemed like impossible miracles or, perhaps, a cruel mockery. Mothers wept at the sight of an empty candy wrapper, not for its lost sweetness, but for what it symbolized. A world where their enemies ate better than German children. Fathers held the cigarette packs as if they were tangible evidence of another planet. Disbelief was palpable. Asterisk impossible. Asterisk they whispered. Asterisk propaganda. Asterisk but the men insisted it was real. They had lived it. The conflict tearing at each returning prisoner was sharp and intensely private. How could they possibly speak of America's bounty without implicitly betraying their shattered homeland? How could they truthfully describe a place where abundance was commonplace while their neighbors were literally starving? Some chose silence, deeply ashamed of their envy, unwilling to face accusations that captivity had softened their resolve. Others spoke carefully, framing their stories as fascinating curiosities rather than damning revelations. A few, braver than most, told the truth bluntly. They had tasted freedom, and it was profoundly sweet. That truth did not always find welcome ears. Some called them liars, some called them traitors, but the seed of change was irrevocably planted, and once planted, it began to grow. The sweetness of freedom lingered in memory more vividly than the clang of gunfire or the burning desert heat. A man might recall unwrapping a chocolate bar beneath the Tennessee sun, its surface softening slightly, the taste exploding deliciously across his tongue, and he would remember that moment far more sharply than the clatter of tanks. Another would recall the simple, casual act of lighting a cigarette, inhaling smoke he knew was plentiful, and feeling a sense of material wealth in his very lungs. These were not trivialities. They were symbols, shorthand for a new world they had briefly glimpsed. For men who had been rigorously taught that fear and unquestioning obedience were the highest virtues, the experience of casual kindness and careless wealth was utterly transformative. The ashes of the German Empire lay scattered everywhere. Factories bombed to skeletons, railroads splintered, fields lying untended. The Reich had demanded ultimate sacrifice and delivered only widespread starvation. The Führer had promised resounding victory and delivered nothing but rubble. Across the ocean, however, the prisoners had witnessed an entirely different model of strength, one not forged in terror, but in abundance. They had seen guards casually toss away half-smoked cigarettes, children eat candy every day, and a society so supremely confident it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own citizens. That stark contrast burned in their minds, a silent, damning indictment of everything they had once believed. Some men carried that memory directly into politics, into classrooms, and into their families. They became staunch advocates for democracy, for rebuilding Germany along the exact lines of the prosperity they had witnessed. They remembered that America's true power lay not only in its massive arsenal, but in its refrigerators, its radios, its supermarkets, the ordinary luxuries that granted dignity to everyday life. Others carried it more quietly, a secret envy, a wistful longing that surfaced every time they tasted meager bread or smoked a cheap, harsh black market cigarette. In both cases, the lesson endured. Prosperity was its own formidable weapon, one that no standing army could effectively match. The climax of this profound transformation was not triggered by a single decisive battle or a powerful speech, but by a quiet realization that arrived slowly, like the break of dawn after a long, dark night. The empire was gone, its ashes dispersed across a ruined continent. In its place arose the faint, trembling possibility of something new, a future informed not by aggression and fear, but by the lingering memory of chocolate and cigarettes. The men who had once been mortal enemies had become crucial witnesses. Witnesses to a society that revealed its strength not through institutional cruelty, but through casual, even thoughtless, generosity. They carried that testimony back to a broken land, where it became essential, fertile soil from which a new Germany would eventually grow. The ships that ferried them home did more than transport bodies. They carried invisible, ideological cargo, memories of unexpected sweetness, symbols of plenty, the thin, curling smoke of freedom in every exhalation. And as the men stepped into the ruins, they could not shake the feeling that history itself had handed them a riddle. The Reich had demanded fierce loyalty in hunger. America had simply offered bewildering abundance in captivity, which ultimately had proved the stronger force. The answer rested not in speeches or political ideology, but in the quiet, undeniable power of a candy bar melting in a prisoner's hand. For many, that was the most haunting truth of all, that their defeat had been written not only on battlefields and in bombing campaigns, but in the casual luxuries of their captors. The ashes of empire were bitter. The sweetness of freedom was unforgettable. And deep in their hearts, they knew that the taste of that sweetness would indelibly shape them and the world they returned to long after the war had ended. And yet, even as they stepped into the ruins, another realization loomed. A final twist of irony more profound than chocolate or cigarettes themselves. They had witnessed prosperity from behind fences, yes, but they had not yet truly reckoned with the immense, unseen force that made it possible. For beneath the sweetness and the ease lay an industrial and economic engine, vast enough, powerful enough, to permanently change the course of human history.